Hello, everybody. Mike from the Rewatch Project with Hannah and Mike and the ChinStroker versus Punter podcasts. I am a lifelong fan of the 1979 Tobe Hooper directed David Soul and James Mason. I'm terrible at impressions. I should never try and do them. Starring miniseries adaptation of Stephen King's 1975 novel Salem's Lot. It was a formative experience for me, this one. The miniseries is one of the first horrors I ever saw, and whilst it was a made for network television, no less, miniseries, it still had a very lasting effect on me, and it's something that I've gone back to and watched many, many times. I'm a big fan of the novel as well, less so of the early 2000s Rob Lowe miniseries version. So yeah, I've been following the non-release of the Gary Dauberman film version, originally meant to be released theatrically and then put on ice for the longest time. I think for a while we wondered if it was actually going to end up being a Catwoman-esque tax write-off, but no, it got released this week to HBO Max. So I am going to go and watch that right now, and then I'm going to immediately come back and tell you what I thought of it. So yeah, I'm going in this with mixed expectations. Obviously, you know, a film doesn't sit on the shelf for a couple of years for no reason. And also, you know, that original is very of its time and is very steeped in nostalgia for me. So I realise that it's unrealistic to go in expecting this to completely meet those expectations. But I'm going to watch it. I'm going to come back, let you know what I think about it. So back soon. And I'm back, so I've just finished watching Salem's Lot 2024, directed by Gary Dauberman and starring Lewis Pullman. And yeah, okay, so, I mean, there's a number of different ways that I can come at this. I can come at this as a horror fan. I can come at this critically, you know, ex-film student, geek, all of those, all of the above. And I can also come at it as a fan of Stephen King and that original miniseries, which did take liberties with the source material, it's worth mentioning. I think what I'll do is I'm going to start off with the positive. Then I'm going to get into a little bit of negative, and then I'm going to finish with some more positive, because I like to be generally as positive as possible about these things. I appreciate the work that goes into films, and I do like to celebrate with positive energy, but at the same time, you are here for my opinion, and I will give that. So I guess first and foremost, what I want to say, my initial reaction was I had fun. I enjoyed this film. I thought it was very entertaining. It's October, you know. I, like a lot of movie fans, particularly genre movie fans, like to watch a lot of horror in October. And I felt that in many ways, this was a refreshing throwback to a different era of filmmaking. I mean, obviously, the book and this adaptation are set in the 70s, but this feels very much like a late 80s, early 90s Stephen King adaptation. You know, I think about things like Pet Sematary, and also Sleepwalkers. That's another one that springs to mind that this feels akin to. It embraces the tropes of the vampire myth. I mean, the original Stephen King, of course, what that did that was so interesting was that it took, you know, the gothic sensibility of Bram Stoker and brought it out of the castles into the small town. So that created an interesting dichotomy. And the book and the film really explored the idea of evil and the idea of community and towns and places drawing people. And that's a very interesting approach. And of course, you know, through everything from Lost Boys and Buffy the Vampire Slayer that have come since, you know, the tropes of and of course the Twilight films, the tropes of the vampire film have become kind of ridiculous, you know. And what that results in is there's two different ways you can go. You can go either very silly, or you can go and deconstruct them and be postmodern. And the thing that I like about this film is it's very earnest. It earnestly embraces those tropes and enjoys them. And it almost felt like this had as much in common with films like Fright Night, you know, very adventure-driven, heroic characters, you know, standing up and using their faith against the monsters. And I really enjoyed that. So I think that this is a great, fun, you know, kind of Friday night horror movie. You know, it's surprisingly nasty in places. That took me by surprise. You know, in its own way, it's quite faithful to the original. In many ways, it isn't, in the same way that the Tobe Hooper one wasn't. And it's interesting that there are direct correlations here between this and the Tobe Hooper version as well. The way that Barlow is presented is very much eliciting that iconic depiction that cadaverous Nosferatu performance by Reggie Nalder in the 1979 version is very much here. So there's a lot of fun to be had of a 1970s setting and all of the aesthetic that goes with that and the music, but with very 21st century digital photography and some really nice uses of color and filtering meant that this was a very entertaining film. I guess where my negatives come into this are in two areas, really. The idea of adaptation, but also just how this is a speed run. You know, it almost feels like adapting the Wikipedia entry for the film. For the book, sorry, because the original miniseries was 3 hours, and that itself got released as a truncated feature-length version, which had similar problems to this. It's really interesting to compare the two. And I don't mind them missing out big chunks of story, but I think what really hurts this version as an adaptation, and also as a film, I think in general terms, how much it decentralizes the relationship between Ben Mears, the protagonist, and the Marston House. And the Marston House itself as a beacon of evil, the idea of it being that evil men are drawn to evil places, and the idea of the trauma that Ben had in his childhood. There's a wonderful scene in the Toby Hooper version, and of course in the book, where he tells the story, where Ben tells the story of sneaking into the Marston house and having a vision of a hanging Hubie Marston. And it's a wonderful scene. Great performance from David Soul. You know, if you think of him as just Hutch from Starsky and Hutch, you really need to take a look at that scene. And the fact that he's there mourning the death of his wife as well. So there's a real weight and a real sense of connection and thematic weight to the character of Ben and his trauma and his relationship with the Marston House, and the Marston House's centrality in the evil that we see, that it drew Straker and Barlow there in the way that it drew Hubie Marston, and will always continue to do that. And those elements just aren't here. And the other area of that film that it hits is the relationship between Susan and Ben. The actress who plays Susan here, Mackenzie Lee, is fine, but the courtship is so rushed that there's no real sense of connection to her and Ben, who is largely a bystander in this film. And in the original miniseries, she was played with a real sense of vulnerable strength. You know, you got the sense that she'd never got out of town and she wanted to, but there was a fear there. And her relationships with Ned Tibbets, which again is really de-emphasized in this version, was emblematic of her inability to leave, you know, and I think that was a really crucial part of defining her character. So I think really what you see here is that this film being reduced to under 2 hours means that essentially there is just no character motivation for our leads. And for any film, that's a big problem. Having said that, I did say I would finish up on a positive, and I would say that ultimately the film works in the ways it needs to work, though, because it does pick its lane, and its lane is pacey, fun, adventure-y, old school, spooky vampire adaptation. And I feel like it largely succeeds. It does descend into CG at a couple of points that feel incongruous to the 70s aesthetic, but largely it works. Alfre Woodard's really good fun. William Sadler does a lot with little in a performance there. And for the most part, it does work. And it feels like Salem's Lot. But I think, you know, I do miss those elements. I mean, the scriptwriter of the original 1979 version was the writer of the Peyton Place TV series. So that tells you the importance of just the huge community. It's a lot like, hey, I'm wearing a t-shirt. It's like Twin Peaks. You know, this idea of like a weird town, and that weird town, that town with an underbelly, with secrets, with darkness, was a really big part, obviously, of the book, but also of that Toby Hooper miniseries, and that's largely issued here. But there are elements of that in there, and it does pay more lip service to those elements from the book than I thought it would, but still, inevitably, that short runtime really does hurt it. But I think that if you're not going in with any of those expectations, and you do just go in looking for a fun throwback to all of those early 90s Stephen King adaptations that you would rent from the video library, you know, after the pub or after school, you know, with your friends, then there's a lot to enjoy here, and it is a really fun film, and it didn't deserve to sit on the shelf for as long as it did. But, you know, if there's a 3-hour version out there. I rarely say this, but this film needed to be longer, and I'd be very interested to see a longer cut. But yeah, Salem's Lot 2024, worth a look, but a cautious recommend. A quick reminder that I do appreciate feedback. Leave comments here. Also, do check out all the other stuff on this channel, namely the Rewatch Project with Hannah and Mike audio podcast, where we go back and rewatch some of our favourite TV shows, and also some of the film, music, TV, and pop culture commentary, analysis, and reactions that are also on this channel. So thank you for watching, and see you soon. Bye-bye.